going to be your MC for this afternoon. Thank you all for coming. It's very pleasing to see such widespread interest in this unique exhibition and event. I'm sure we're all going to be thoroughly engrossed in the talks that we're about to hear and the exhibition, Australians with Serbs in World War I.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much, Christine. I'd like to also thank a couple of people and institutions, especially the Army Museum that is hosting this. Without their help, we wouldn't be here today. I would also like to thank particularly the people who put the displays together. Wayne Birch, who's in the background there, who is the curator here at the museum. His colleagues Brenton Williams and also Henry Jolly. Thank you very much for putting this together. I'd also like to just mention a special mention of Denny Jovanovic, who has contributed to the exhibition by lending us some amazing items from his private collection, including the mannequin of the World War I Serbian soldier that we see there. So Danny, thank you very much. And also Danny, thank you for continuing the tradition started in 1950 of marching as the Serbian Ex-Servicemen Association every Anzac Day since that time. Well done, and thank you for continuing that tradition started by our fathers. I would also like to offer a special welcome to the members of the Serbian community for coming here, and I won't name everyone because there's too many to name. And I'd like to especially welcome the people who are descended or a family of the people that we're going to discuss in a moment. I'd also like to extend a welcome to Mr. Patrick Forbes, MC, who is sitting in the audience. Patrick, amongst other callings, was the Senior Australian Trade Commissioner and Councillor Commercial at the Australian Embassy in Belgrade. And so he has some association with that part of the world. But he was also my commanding officer at the Adelaide University Regiment many, many years ago. So welcome, Patrick. This exhibit is part of three that is shown through Brisbane and also in Melbourne. And it is in fact a part of a project that I've been involved in and also with a group of descendants of people who served in Serbia in World War I. So in the presentations I will just take you through what happened, i.e. the history of what happened with the Australians who went to serve. The medical side of the war is going to be kindly explained by Dr. Annette Summers, and then Mr. and Mrs. Morrison, Mrs. Anne Morrison and her son Dr. Rob Morrison will talk about one of their one of the ladies who served in Serbia in the Scottish Women's Hospitals, and then Rory Hope will talk about his family members, Dr. Charles and Laura Hope. And presenting afterwards will be the experience of this war in the art that we see behind us, and we'll have some comments from Christine Gill. There were basically 5 groups who served from Australia and New Zealand in Serbia. The first group, roughly, are medical volunteers. So these are people who volunteered for service but weren't in the armed services. So they were in the Red Cross, they were in voluntary organisations, and mainly the Australians were joining organisations in England and then serving in countries like France, Belgium and Serbia and Russia. And they served throughout the war, even though the war took sort of a terrible turn while they were there in Serbia. Then there were soldiers in the campaign. There were small units of the AIF there, which was not widely known. One was a group of drivers from the 22nd and 24th Battalions, Australian Infantry Battalions, and they accompanied the 10th Division, British Division, who actually marched into Serbia with French forces in 1915. And they were engaged in a battle at a village called Kosturina, which I've covered in the book. And they also were accompanied by Australians who were serving in the British Division, the 10th Division, and then other units as well. And so they weren't identified as Australian particularly Australian units or soldiers, but they were Australians who, for one reason or another, were serving in the British Army. There were also people serving in the Air Force, the hospital ships that were catering for the campaign. There were also 6 Australian destroyers in the Adriatic and the Aegean seas, and they were doing anti-submarine warfare, escort duties, and there were also Australians involved in merchant ships, which were troop carriers or supplying the armies. And then in 1917 and 18, a large contingent of Australian Army nurses also served there. So these were in the armed forces, nurses, not like volunteers who were in the British Red Cross or the Scottish Women's Hospitals and other organisations. And lastly, there was a small group of volunteers, so-called South Slav volunteers. So these were people who were in Australia at the time, who might have been of Serbian or other Slavic origin, so they would have been Czechs, Croats, Slovenes, who volunteered to serve with the Serbian army. And they were recruited by the Australian army, partially trained, and the Australian army then took them to Salonika, and they then joined the Serbian army. So they were a group that were really sort of lost in history until we discovered them, and they've got descendants here. Look, there was another group that was involved in this, and that was the donors. There were people donating money in Australia and who were helping the cause of the medical volunteers and the refugee help and so on. And then lastly, one group that stood out because of interest in medals was people who were decorated by Serbian medals. Now, I'm wearing the Serbian medals of my great uncle on this side. I thought it would be appropriate for the occasion to marry it up with my little Australian medal so that in one chest you've got two nations symbolically represented. But there are lots of Australians there are 154 Australians and New Zealanders who were decorated, and some of those descendants are here today. There was this campaign. It was really a little well known. Basically, it was overshadowed by Gallipoli and the Western Front. And yes, this is not the sort of large campaign that is like the Western Front, but nevertheless, I think it deserves its place in the sun. And especially, it is important for those people who are descendants of the people who served, that their forebears' service be recognised. And so I think by doing our research and by contributing to the knowledge of what happened, we're adding basically to the nation's memory of those that served, and we're also then able to commemorate their service more accurately. It is important also to people of some direct or indirect Serbian heritage in Australia, and there will be several 100,000 people like that now. They are also involved in this because whether they were soldiers or civilians, people from that time were involved in the war because it was invaded and occupied by the enemy. So they have an interest in this as well. And it is actually of some interest to people in Serbia, as they have shown interest in this, and articles have been published about this in Serbia. The books that we talked about, which were out in the front, are the history. One is about medals and Australians who were decorated, and also there have been articles in the RSL and genealogy journals who helped me in my research, because it was really to do with researching. I commissioned the Victorian Genealogical Society to find descendants of the Australians who served. And they told me that was a very difficult thing to do, because normally people come to them and say, look, I'm here, so who's my grandfather and where was he, and so on. And what we were asking them to do is to go back to World War I and then come forward to now. And that was unusual, and we had a bit of trouble with that. But once we started getting people together, especially people on social media, it grew. And basically we've established now a network of descendants and families of those who had served in Serbia. And it's quite an active group with people right throughout Australia and New Zealand. And this led us to go and see the Australian War Memorial as a group. And we asked the Serbian embassy to get us an appointment with Dr. Brendan Nelson, who was then the director of the War Museum. And we asked him, well, where is the record of all these people who served in Serbia in World War I? Where is it in the Australian War Memorial? And he said, well, there's a history involved in this, and it is explained in the book. After the World War I, the Australian government asked Serbia to donate a full set of uniforms and weapons of Serbian soldiers, and they did that with other allied countries as well. And so this was actually in the museum for quite a few years. I remember seeing it in the World War I galleries. But then over time it's been sort of put away and locked away, and basically there's nothing on display. There's one or two items that talk about the Salonika front, but not much. So he kindly agreed then that something should be done about it, and with all the descendants in the group, we were able to sort of say something needs to be done now, because they were in the middle of now enlarging the War Memorial, and said, well, we don't have enough space, of course, for all the things that we have. So they agreed to that we would work together with the Australian War Memorial to produce a digital presentation on their website, and that is now the bottom left-hand side that you can see there. That is now in the Australian War Memorial, and it's a digital representation at least, but not a physical one. We're working on a physical one as well with him, or with them. It's gone, and we hope that something will eventuate. Also, the Department of Veterans Affairs, we went as a group of descendants, Australians and Serb descendants of people who were in this campaign, and asked them the same question, and we got the agreement from the minister, who was Darren Chester at that time, to do the same thing. So then we worked with the Department of Veterans Affairs, and that's the website on the right-hand side bottom, which has stories. They've chosen to focus on women in war, and this is basically for school projects. And so there are biographies there of a dozen people, mostly women, but not all, as well as the sort of general story of the war. So just moving to the war very quickly, as to what actually happened. Probably the first thing to do is to start with the geography so that we know where things are. One of the reasons why this campaign is not well known is because the names have changed, the borders have changed, everything has changed. It's very difficult for a person to know what happened because you don't know where it is. So at that time, there's little Serbia there, and it wedged between this Austria-Hungary and German Empire, and the port of Salonika is just there, and it's now called Thessaloniki, so you can't find it except in the new name. And that was the only way to get to Serbia, by sea, and there was a little railway running there, and that became important in this story. And of course, Bulgaria joined the war 1 year later and attacked Serbia whilst the Germans and the Serbians got attacked by Austria-Hungary and Germany from here. And then the Ottoman Empire was, of course, with them. So these powers, the Central Powers, were the problem for Serbia because they were sort of stuck in the middle, unfortunately. And when the Gallipoli campaign started, that basically sealed Serbia's role in the war because Germany had to supply Turkey, Ottoman Turkey, with the Gallipoli campaign and in Egypt as well, where they were fighting the British. So basically they needed the railway and the river traffic that goes through Serbia into Bulgaria, which was on their side, and into Constantinople. And Turkey, at the end of 1915, is this withdrawal, where the Serbian army, the government, had to withdraw. And the Australians that were there, the New Zealanders, faced the decision. What did they do? Did they withdraw with the army, or did they stay there and be captured and detained by the enemy? Now, some left because they were told to leave also, because the Serbs were telling them to leave. But some stayed. And as we shall hear from Dr. Rory Hope in a moment, some stayed and knew they would be detained by the enemy, and they were. And then they were released later, luckily. But yes, it was a decision. It was also a decision for the Serbian government, the army, etc., whether do you leave your own country and go and fight with the Allies outside your own country. This is the sort of thing we don't think about here. They basically voluntarily left their own country so they could fight with the Allies somewhere else, which the Allies then took them to Salonika, and they took up the war again there. This is a photo of Agnes Bennett with the Serbian Crown Prince, and this is General Vasic, is the commander of the 3rd Serbian Army, which she was supporting, one of the hospitals that was supporting. And this is the camp, of tented camp, which they set up in the rear of the Serbian army to take the wounded. I'm not sort of sure whether you'd call it a field hospital or maybe Dr. Summers can explain it better, but basically they were receiving wounded from the mountains. You can see some of them in the background, but there were higher mountains further up. And some of them they were treating as they came down by mules and then by ambulances when they could get them to the hospitals. Others they were treating behind the front lines because they set up dressing stations further forward, and then they operated sometimes in these setups behind the Serbian army.
It's Ostrava, Lake Ostrava.
So we're on top of a mountain here, obviously, retracing the route of these Australians. And this is very, as you can see, high country. It's covered in snow during winter. This is the lake, Lake Ostrava, and this is where the camp was, just there. And so they were listening. This mountain was being held by the Germans and the Bulgarians, and the Serbs were on this side trying to take the mountain, running uphill trying to take it. And so there were a lot of casualties. And the Australian hospital was basically being fed by men from this mountain and coming down to the hospital as they got wounded. Lastly, I'd like to just mention that the decorated people. This is a photo of a famous photo of decorations being handed over to Australian soldiers, which were Serbian decorations. This is a photo from the Australian War Memorial of an Australian officer being decorated by a very high general of the British Army, who I think was in charge of all of the light horse that was serving there. I forget his name now, but we had trouble identifying this officer, a lot of trouble, because we knew he was decorated with the Order of the White Eagle, which is this decoration here, which is out there. But we couldn't quite, we got it down to 2 people we thought could be in Palestine. He was in the Camel Corps. And so we finally got the 2, and we had talked to the descendants of one of these people, and they said, no, he was taller than him when they saw the photo. So we are now very sure that this is Charles Robert Victor Wright from Adelaide, who is being decorated. And what really intrigued us is what he's holding here. I mean, he's being decorated for distinguished service, and he's holding something in his hand. It's not a sword, it's not a rifle, it's not a riding whip. So what could it be? No, it's not a cricket bat. It's a big fly swat. When you're driving around with camels, you need a very big fly swat.
First, I want to talk about the First World War. It was the first truly industrial conflict in human history. Never before had rifle fire, artillery barrage been employed on a global scale. And the total number of military and civilian casualties in World War I was about 40 million. And estimates range from around 15 to 22 million deaths and about 23 million wounded personnel, ranking it amongst the deadliest conflicts in human history. In Australia, a country with a population of fewer than 5 million people, 62,000 were killed and 156,000 wounded, gassed or taken prisoner. And these are enormous numbers. It's to provide not only military assistance but humanitarian and medical assistance in this global conflict, which we've heard about from Boyan. In Australia, in its bid to go to the aid of the mother country in its hour of need, people were passionate to be involved. Consequently, men joined up in their thousands to fight in the war, and for many it was an adventure. Also, medical practitioners and nurses were anxious to give their service, as we've heard, and help our boys at the front, and also have an adventure. Military and civilian war hospitals often nursed up to 2,000 patients and were in mainly tented accommodation in war zones. And that picture that Boyan showed us, that would have been a field hospital. Had tents and it was in a field, so I'm making the big assumption it was a field hospital. However, frequently a suitable building was commandeered for hospital purposes, and this was generally the place like in England, where many a country house was used for this purpose. It's hard to imagine the size of these organisations, but it's interesting to compare to the new Royal Adelaide Hospital, which we have now, which I believe has a bed capacity of about 800. So when you're looking at 1,000 or 2,000, you can just imagine the size of it. And we need to multiply the 800 by at least 3. And that also includes all the ancillary departments to service the hospital, such as X-ray, pharmacy, dental, physiotherapy, etc. It's actually hard to imagine the size of it. I just want to look now at turn to the medical organisation and management. We have got the pictures up, good. Of illness and surgery that the Hopes and Mary Sterling, the two people that I've been concentrating on, would have encountered while serving in Serbia. When the Hopes arrived in Serbia in 1915, there was an epidemic, as we've been told, of typhus that raged through the country. Typhus is a disease transmitted through the human body lass and is the scourge of soldiers, especially in trench warfare where it's impossible to maintain hygiene. It was also epidemic in prisoner of war camps and other areas where humans are banded together with poor water, food and hygiene sources. It was the major cause of death at the time in Serbia, and over 150,000 people died from it. A third of them were prisoners of war. Up to 40% of people with typhus die from this disease, and it was a major cause of death among those who were nursing the sick. It's the doctors, the nurses, the orderlies, anybody else who was involved. During the war, there was considerable research to find a vaccine, but this was not successful until well after World War I. Unfortunately, typhus was not the only disease prevalent at the time. There were many diseases such as tuberculosis, measles, diphtheria, polio, and venereal disease or sexually transmitted diseases. Finally, in the medical issues, psychiatric disorders were brought to the fore in World War I and would have been an issue for the Hopes in Serbia, and that was alluded to by Boyan earlier on. For psychiatry, it was a relatively new medical concept, and much of the medical fraternity, military commanders and general population considered it a sign of weakness. Many cases of what we now think of as PTSD or mental illness were recorded as malingering, and I've seen that in military records that he was malingering. Most trauma came from gunshot wounds, blast wounds and burns, but many came from road accidents, and you'd be amazed at how many road accidents. I've studied a lot in World War II and were just enormous. Mostly it was orthopaedic work and head injuries, but also repairing tissue and devastating internal damage. It was because of this that many advances were made in orthopaedic management and the resetting of bones, where in the past perhaps the limb would just simply have been amputated. Great advances were made in World War I in plastic surgery and skin grafting and in anaesthetics. The advent of X-ray contributed greatly to diagnosis and therefore the management of injuries. Portable X-ray machines were available and South Australians used them in Gallipoli. They had a portable X-ray machine, I'm surprised about that. But as I alluded to before, in many cases infection became the scourge of surgery. Operations were undertaken in less than ideal conditions, and the wounds were dirty in the first place. When you've got a blast wound, it takes into the wound dirt, and you have to get that out. But unfortunately, you don't always get it out, and they didn't really understand about the microscopic problem of infection. But before I finish that, I really must just say dental problems were a curse, and probably still are a curse of the army. People didn't look after their teeth, and that stops you eating, it stops you talking, it stops you performing. If you get I cut that bit out because Boyan said I needed to shorten my talk, but I want to put it in, and I want to tell you that dental problems is an enormous problem, and the people in Serbia would have definitely faced that, as well as obstetric and gynecological problems. I think I've got a second. I can tell you that in many of the things that we've been involved in recent times, in other countries like Rwanda, Timor, etc., the first thing that usually confronts our soldiers and our medical people is somebody coming in pregnant and wants to give birth. And of course, our doctors and soldiers don't do that sort of thing. And I'm quite sure that they would have many births and gynecological issues in Serbia at the time. So, now I've got that bit in, I feel happy. So to conclude the workload, the number of patients, the mental stress would have been horrendous during this time in Serbia. Working hours would have been continuous, with little or no time off. Our Western society today, including our health professionals, have no concept of this sort of workload, which doesn't stop at the end of an 8-hour shift with time off for meal breaks. It goes on for days, weeks, months, and sometimes years. Thank you very much.
I'd now like to introduce our next speakers, Mrs. Anna Morrison and Dr. Rob Morrison.
You can remember your Aunt Mary. Tell us a bit of what she was like.
Well, Aunt Mary was a very forthright person, and I can remember we had a terrible storm once, and my brother said, my Aunt Mary would never allow that. I can't see her stopping a storm, but that was the impression she could give. And she travelled quite widely in Europe, and she went to Egypt. And one of the things I remember was a beautiful ibis, wooden ibis that she had.
We have a picture in the family album of her at, I think, the South Australian Art Society or something, doing a drawing. Oh, very competent painting and looking quite stylish. You said amongst the Sterlings she was the only stylish one?
Yes. They all looked nice, but she was the only one with style. And even at 8, I could recognise her. And I remember the day she died because Dr. Violet Plummer, a great friend of ours.
Let me just first, before we get onto that, I was going to get onto that, but let me first of all read a letter that came. Mary died in London, and Violet Plummer was one of the very early female graduates of the medical school where Stirling had been insistent that women should be doctors. So Violet Plummer was with Mary when she died, and she wrote to Lady Stirling on the 27th of April in 1925. I'll just read part of it. My dear Lady Stirling, our dear Mary passed away this morning quite peacefully, but it's been so sudden that I can't quite realise it. I can only be too thankful that I was in London at the time. I only arrived on Tuesday, and on Friday I spent the morning with Mary. She looked very ill and complained very much of pains in her head. She was seeing Dr. Ripman that night. On Saturday we had lunch at the Lyceum, and she insisted on going to a matinee at the theatre. I found her more cheerful, and she seemed so delighted at having me with her. We had tea together, and she began to look very tired, so I packed her suitcase, phoned up the hospital she knew of in Baker Street, and also rang Dr. Ripman. She chaffed me all the time about my autocratic manner, but by the time we'd got her to bed, she seemed very pleased at being taken charge of. Dr. Ripman called that evening and ordered her a mild sedative. In the morning she was unconscious, and she never rallied or spoke again. I feel you would like to hear all these details. Being so far away, it would be some comfort to you to know that she was in hospital with sympathetic nurses who never left her for one moment. Her last action on leaving the flat was to take your photo with her under her arm, and she placed it on her dressing table in the hospital before she took off her hat. I shall never forget her last words to me. She was so grateful and so sweet to me, and said such wonderful things, and it was so rare of Mary to be at all demonstrative that I appreciated it all the more. And you were actually awake when the news of her death came to Adelaide, weren't you? What happened there?
Yes, I was in bed at home away from school. I had flu, I think, and I can remember my grandmother, my father's mother, was there, because my mother had to go to a meeting. And I remember all the talk. And the telephone, of course there was no telephone to England, but the cable was coming. And Aunt Mary was very ill, and then she was worse. And then finally that she had died. And that was pretty horrifying. You know, I wasn't used to family members dying at that stage. I think that's all I have.
Charles Henry Standish Hope, his full name was, Charles, whose parents were Protestant Irish immigrants, was born a strong, healthy child, according to his father's diaries, which I have. In 1871, when Charles was 10 years old, his father recorded in his diary, "Charles is backward in reading. He reads French or Latin much better than English. No doubt he will come to read English when he gets more confidence." It's interesting, we're talking about a 10-year-old child here. In 1883, aged 22, Charles graduated with a Bachelor of Arts from Cambridge University, and in 1889 he obtained a Bachelor of Medicine and Bachelor of Surgery here at the University of Adelaide. He, like Laura, which we'll come to in a minute, was amongst the first medical graduates from the University of Adelaide. 2 years later, in 1891, he was registered to practice medicine in South Australia and was also awarded the higher degree of Doctor of Medicine. Despite his father's misgivings about him being slow and lacking self-confidence and reliance, Charles was clearly a bright young man, albeit with a rather reserved personality. He initially set up private practice in Adelaide, but strangely perhaps, didn't enjoy it at all. I think he was a very shy person, and he didn't like the experience he had setting up private practice in Adelaide. He very soon met and married Laura, who was 6 years younger than him. Laura Margaret Fowler, to give her full title, is Laura in the centre in that, well, they're all pictures of Laura of different ages. She was born in Adelaide in 1868. Her family had immigrated from Scotland and built up a successful wholesale business. Many of you will have heard or will know of DJ Fowler. When 17 years old, she matriculated with very high grades in all her subjects. But she always wanted to be a doctor. But at that time, there was heated and, to our minds today, farcical debate about the suitability of medicine as a profession for women, especially 18-year-olds like Laura was. Laura persevered doggedly with her ambition, and in 1887 she was permitted to enter the medical course at the University of Adelaide. 4 years later, that's 1891, she became the first woman medical graduate in South Australia. Laura was described as a slender woman with blue eyes, brown hair, and with a sense of fun beneath a precise, composed manner. A university colleague of hers, a woman called Violet Plummer, wrote that Laura is a truly beautiful woman who emanated calm assurance, strength of character, and love for her fellow men. What mainly concerns us here today is the voluntary medical work in field hospitals in Serbia during World War I, and the nature of that's already been described. Amazingly, even after their traumatic experiences in Serbia and when they were released as prisoners of war there and went back to England for a short time, Charles and Laura both returned to India. And in 1916, they went back to where they'd been before to continue their work. At one time, when stationed at the Church of Scotland mission at Kamling Kong in North Bengal, Laura was in medical charge of over 540 orphan children and 73 staff. For their work in India, they received the Kaiser-i-Hind Medal for distinguished work in advancement of the public interest in India. The Hopes retired to Adelaide in 1934. Charles died in 1942, aged 81, and Laura died some 10 years later in 1952, aged 84, and they had no children.
It's interesting that my mother never introduced me to Laura because I was 12 when she died, and you would think that it would have been, certainly from my point of view, I would have loved to have, looking back, to have met Laura, but apparently I was never introduced to Laura, which is odd. My father was killed in the war, but my mother, who was a strong sort of family person, never mentioned Laura for some reason that I find strange. To summarise then, Charles and Laura, who came from what could be called privileged backgrounds, would have been well able to live comfortable lives in Adelaide, supported socially and financially by their families. Instead, these two remarkable South Australians gave the bulk of their life's endeavours to providing medical care to people in urgent need in India and in Serbia. We can never know for certain what motivated them, but the content of their diaries and letters, some of which are in the South Australian Library, some of which Boyan and I have in our personal possession, strongly suggest that they were influenced by a genuine concern for the well-being of others. I'd like to thank Boyan for getting me interested in this topic. I'd like to thank the Bar Smith Library at the University of Adelaide for making available some of the photographs, and the State Library for access to the Fowler papers. Thank you.
So on this slide, we have two sketches made by the Serbian artist Dragomir Glisic. As a conscript, Glisic participated in the Balkan Wars as a war painter, which preceded the First World War. And then in the First World War, he worked as a war artist and photographer in the Danube and Moravian divisions. His output includes drawings, photographs and paintings, and represents one of the most valuable visual documents of the Serbian army in the First. We now have several paintings by Serbian artists. The first painting for Serbian war veteran is by Vladimir Bečić. Serbian men had been mobilised into the army for the First and Second Balkan Wars in 1912 and 13 and continued to serve, if they survived, until the end of 1918. The portraits by the Serbian war artists accompanying the army increasingly show the strain of continuous military service, which we can see in this portrait of a war-weary, probably prematurely aged soldier. The second painting, titled Where Are You Setting My Son? 1915-16, is by Serbian artist Milos Golubovic. So these are two lithographs. The first one, entitled Serbian Children Refugees. The artist depicts a group of 5 children, probably from the same family, who've been displaced from their home and probably their village. The whereabouts of their parents is unknown, possibly they've been orphaned. They look very sad and downtrodden, but they're also very supportive of each other, the older children holding the hands of the younger children. It's a very touching lithograph, I think. And in the second lithograph, titled Serbian Women Refugees with Child, an older woman, possibly the grandmother, looks down at the younger woman, her daughter, with her baby. They appear alone in a bare, somewhat barren landscape, probably fleeing from their traumatic situation, but taking a moment to rest. In these and other lithographs, Steinlen manages to capture in a few quick strokes the impact of war on innocent civilians, particularly women and children. The next 2 slides depict some posters from the war in Serbia. On the first slide, we have 2 posters referencing Serbian Day, 25 June 1916. These posters commemorate the Battle of Kosovo, a heavy defeat for the Serbs during World War I. They were produced in France to raise funds for Serbian refugees. And the poster on the right is another work by Teofil Steinlen, and is an expressive image of a group of Serbian citizens and soldiers as they head into the mountain regions of Albania and Montenegro, a tragic result of the 1915 invasion from Austria-Hungary and the German forces. The poster on the left is by the French artist Dominique Charles Fouqueret. It depicts a chaotic scene of the withdrawal across a snow-covered bridge by soldiers, citizens and their livestock. One of the crowd carries a Serbian flag. The place has been identified as Lumkula in Albania. Fouqueret was also an established artist at the start of the First World War, having already been awarded the prestigious award of Officier de la Légion d'honneur in 1909. He became an official painter to the French Navy and sailed on several tours to the colonies in Africa, Asia and Oceania. And like Steinman, he was particularly moved by the plight of the Serbian refugees and contributed to fundraising through the production of posters such as this one. Next slide, please. A third French artist who produced a poster for 25 June 1916 was Pierre Moog. He was younger than the previous two artists, born in Paris in 1890, so only 26 at the time of producing this poster. The second posting on the right-hand side is by an Italian-American artist called Cyrus Cuneo, known as Ciro, Serbia. This work is entitled Brave Nurses in the Retreat of the Serbian Army 1915-16. It's a complicated work because of the number of people, the wagons and the rocky landscape, which suggests it was a difficult retreat. It's quite a large poster, it's worth having a look at because it's extremely well done. The people are on the move and the artist has captured this moment in time almost like a photograph. Ciro's war paintings were highly regarded by the British government, and one of his 1915 paintings was auctioned and raised sufficient funds to purchase 2 ambulances which were sent to France bearing the inscription, the Cyrus Cuneo Ambulance. We don't know who the photographers were or the identity of the subjects in this next group of slides, but they do provide a valuable insight into the Serbian campaign. The first photograph, this one, dates back to 1914 and is a portrait of Serbian sergeants wearing full uniform, including the distinctive Serbian army cap, which I'm not going to try to pronounce this time, but we can view that in the display cabinet. Young men such as these formed the backbone of the Serbian army, which was composed of conscripted men of fighting age, and this photograph was probably taken prior to any combat, as their uniforms appear to be in pristine condition. This photograph has been identified as a particular date, 29 July 1914, so right at the beginning of the war, and shows the Serbian 7th Infantry Regiment marching to the front, led by drums and bugles. In this photograph, the men look happy and proud, obviously not yet aware of the horrors that they are shortly going to face. And the final slide. And this is a photograph of Miles Franklin, or Stella Franklin as she would have been known then, is the woman, the nurse in the middle of this group. And Stella, or Miles or Stella, volunteered with the Scottish Women's Hospitals for Foreign Service in World War I and served in the Serbian occupation. And she subsequently wrote a memoir called Neimari Nista of her experience serving with the Serbs, who she described as, quote, like big brothers, protective and chivalrous. So she obviously had a very positive interaction with the Serbian soldiers and orderlies that she was working with for a number of months. So I'd be quite interested to read that. That's now the end of the slides. Just before I finish, Boyne did mention at the beginning of his talk a woman called Olive King, and I'd like to read something written by Olive, which gives a somewhat different perspective to the Serbian campaign and probably the First World War in general. It's a poem. She, as Boyne mentioned, she served with the Scottish Women's Hospital, and Olive wrote this poem after her last meeting with Jovi in Belgrade in 1922. If I should not to return to you, but meet alone our common fate, I do not ask you to be true, nor turn from some lucky mate. No, I would say, forget my sweet, nor wear a crepe-hung robe for me. Perchance again our paths may meet, when you become as I shall be. Olive and Milan never met again after this, but they wrote to each other over the years, and Olive kept his photograph by her bedside. So thank you.